This interview with Professor JWR Whitehand takes place in the University of Birmingham in October 2016, and it focuses on his contribution to the field of urban morphology over the last 5 decades. Good afternoon, Professor JWR Whitehand. What led you to study geography?
Well, I think thinking back, probably one of the main influences was a teacher that I had in the, probably starting at the end of the 1940s. I can't remember the exact years, but his name was R.W. Brooker, and I knew him as Mr. Brooker because in those days I was a very junior scholar, and we either called our masters Mr. or perhaps more often Sir. But he was a very talented teacher, and his subject was geography, and he made that subject come alive to us. And he was also a bit of a joker, and he was able to incorporate the light-hearted elements in what he was saying about these various places around the world. So I think probably that was the beginning of my interest, and that continued through well into the 1950s. And I would say after that, probably the school influences, after he ceased to be my geography teacher, the school influences were probably fairly minimal, and until, of course, came to the university time.
I believe you started studying in the University of Reading in the end of the 50s. How were your student days?
Well, I enjoyed them immensely. As far as my interest in geography is concerned, it may sound curious, but one of the significant influences was the fact that I was a very keen tennis player. Now that may amuse you because you can't think what the connection might be with geography. But also in the university tennis team were 2 research students in geography. In fact, one of my most frequent partners was doing a PhD in geography. So in that way, and we would play matches all over the country. And indeed, I was also playing tournaments when I was in my late teens and even into my early 20s. I was playing tournament tennis quite widely, and that gave me, of course, opportunities to see many places, and it was places I was interested in. But the key thing was really that these 2 PhD scholars I mentioned, Graham Whittington and Pat Hamilton, they were working, well, Pat Hamilton in particular was working in the field of, I think, what we probably would call urban morphology, although he was particularly concerned with settlements, not just urban ones, but also rural ones. And I was very interested in the maps that he was doing for his thesis. And it was much more that than the actual lectures that I was getting in Reading, which were good, but they were not, perhaps one might say, inspiring. And it was those relationships with those 2 research students, and of course, being that I was perhaps twice a week or even more with them on the tennis court, and then afterwards we would have tea breaks and so on, and we were talking about things to do with geographical research. And I think as an undergraduate, as a 19-year-old, that certainly influenced me, and it influenced what I went on to be later.
Annick Northumberland, a study in town plan analysis, was published after you started your PhD in reading. Do you remember your first contact with the book?
Yes, I think I do. And it wasn't directly with the book. It was, I believe, with my PhD supervisor, Peter Wood. I'd already, by the time the annex study came out, was well into my PhD thesis. And I remember Peter, probably in the spring of 1961, I don't know, certainly I was well into my thesis, drawing attention to the publication of the annex book that had come out within a couple of months or so previously. I wasn't at that time a member of the Institute of British Geographers, which published that book, so I didn't automatically get it. And he made some comment about it, about the detail in it, and I can't remember the adjective he used to describe it, but it was something like the abstruseness of it, meaning it was a bit esoteric. He certainly wasn't pushing me in that direction. As Peter did, he left things very much for me to decide. But it was far from being a push towards annex. So I think that's my first knowledge of it. I then, of course, did read it. And looking back at the thesis now, yes, there are some references to it, but not in detail. I was already committed to looking at a large number of settlements in relation to one another, as well as their internal morphological structures, so that some of the ideas of Anik, yes, I'm sure a close reader of my thesis would be able to detect them, but it was not a major factor as far as my PhD work is concerned.
Was it the first text by M.R.G. Conzent that you have read?
I think it almost certainly was, yes. I can't remember whether at that time, the book on, I'm fairly sure his very well-known study of Whitby, which was not widely available, and the other thing that I might have known about was the 1962 study of central Newcastle upon Tyne. But by that time, I was getting towards the end of my thesis, and so the influence of that must have been quite minimal, I think.
We have already talked about your thesis. It was concluded in 1964. It was about settlements.
Yes, it was about settlements or settlement patterns. It was about individual settlements, but also the pattern of settlements, the distribution of settlements and their relationships to one another in an area called the Chiltern Hills, which Chiltern Hills are located to the northwest of London. I covered a very extensive area. I guess, I can't remember exactly, but I probably spent as much as 15 to 17 months just on the field work, going around mapping these settlements, particularly mapping them as in relation to building types. It was that really had caught my imagination, partly through Pat Hamilton's work, but partly a wish to get away from the many studies that had been done prior to then of street systems. There was a very strong emphasis in settlement studies up till that point, and I think in many languages, including even in the German language. And I wanted to diversify from that, because it seemed to me that the forms of cities and towns and smaller settlements very much related to the building types. So that was what I gave my main emphasis to. And indeed, after the thesis was finished, that was as far as I remember, was the first paper I published on, it was on settlement patterns based on my thesis.
2 years later, you have published your first paper on fringe belts. Fringe belts, a neglected aspect of urban geography. And that paper offered the first application of the concept to a multinuclear conurbation, Tyne said. After that, and over the last 5 decades, you have published a large number of fundamental texts exploring many different dimensions of this morphological concept. Could you talk about this 5 decades interest on this concept that was proposed back in the 30s?
Well, I can at least talk about the beginnings of that. It's a long story, as you're more than implying there. That interest developed when I moved to my first full-time academic post, which was in what had just become the University of Newcastle upon Tyne, formerly King's College in the University of Durham. And my move there, at that time, M.R.G. Conzen was a well-known researcher in that university, but curiously enough, when the post was advertised that I went to, he wasn't even on my interviewing panel. Anyway, I got there, and of course I was very quickly struck by the work he was doing on fringe belts. But I was also, what also influenced me was, strangely enough, or maybe not so strangely, the fact that I found myself working within and in a fringe belt, travelling daily to that fringe belt, through a middle fringe belt, and actually living in an outer fringe belt, and in a conurbation that was made up of, I don't know, probably 8, 9, 10 originally separate settlements, of which Newcastle and Gateshead were the largest. So it was very hard for me to avoid the influence of these fringe belts and awareness of those fringe belts. And I think that's how that's really how it started. The story of how that interest then developed is, as you're saying, a very long story, and incorporates all sorts of aspects, which indeed we could perhaps get onto at a later stage. But those other aspects incorporate a lot of other facets of the development of urban morphology, which I suspect you want to explore. But just to very quickly summarize that fringe belt, the development of that fringe belt research, as you've said, it began in Tyneside. It then continued in a number of European cities, places that I had the opportunity to travel to for one reason or another. It might be a field course, it might be a deliberate interest in picking out a certain place because I sensed that the concept of the fringe belt will be particularly fruitful to explore there. I looked at, or more than looked at, I studied in detail parts of Glasgow, in other parts of Europe, in France, Clermont-Ferrand, much later, studied Visby in the Baltic Sea, the Swedish place, and a number of other much more complex cities, in relatively recent time when I started developing an interest in China. But that, in a sense, takes us on to a further stage of the developing interest in urban morphology. But we can obviously expand on that if you would like to.
You have talked about your Newcastle teaching experience. Could you also talk about the Glasgow experience?
Well, the Glasgow experience was rather different from the Newcastle one. The Newcastle one was in a way dominated by M.R.G. Conson, but I don't mean that in any sort of impelling way. It's just that when I got to Newcastle and met for the first time Con, as I came to know him immediately, and he insisted on the use of that term. Even his wife called him Con. We quickly hit it off, and we would meet almost every day. So we often took lunch together, for example, in the staff house, and I was given an introductory course in human geography, which was fine. I had 5, I think, personal tutees, very much on the Oxford model in that particular respect. And I was involved in a practical course. I didn't have a heavy load, which was nice, and I took a very full part in Con's, mainly third-year undergraduate option work, which was to a large extent done in seminars, and particularly in field seminars. He very much believed in that form of communication with students, and he had, to me, new ideas and interesting ideas about how to run seminars in an effective way that students enjoyed and evidently got a lot out of them. He was a great believer in dialectics, and he set up his seminars in a way sympathetic to that notion of dialectics, the idea of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And he would have, the seminars would be organized, so there was a seminar leader, one of the students. One of the students would be the discussion leader, and in the course of the discussion, which brought in all the students, we would lead towards a bringing together of the different views on the particular topic that was under discussion. And this sort of thing would also go on in the field. So sometimes we would gather as a group, perhaps 8 or 10 of us, in a particular part of a settlement, and we might be there for half an hour, or even more, discussing the relationships that could be detected in the urban landscape. Now, when I came to go to Glasgow, it was a very different atmosphere. It was much less research-centred than it had been in Newcastle. I took on responsibility for urban geography from a well-known urban geographer, Derek Diamond. I got my first research students when I was there. Incidentally, Michael Bark, who's become a notable figure in an international seminar on urban form, he came to Glasgow while I was there. I was not actually his supervisor, but we very quickly got to know one another well, and he developed an interest in fringe belts. I gave a number of courses there, including seminar courses, and the way in which I did them was influenced quite significantly by the way Con was doing them in Newcastle. But it became clear to me fairly soon after I went to Glasgow that I was not going to settle there for the long term. There just wasn't the degree of research focus that I'd fairly quickly become accustomed to in Newcastle. I started doing some research in Glasgow that I found very interesting, including some research on fringe belts. But I was, within a couple of years, I was interested in making a move, and that move brought me back to England and central England, and the beginning, in a sense, of another phase of the development of my interest in urban morphology.
As you've moved here to the University of Birmingham in 1971 to teach urban geography. And how was the university, and particularly the School of Geography, Earth and Environmental Sciences at that time?
Well, at that time it was the School of Geography, just, although that was quite a big school. And the circumstances of my coming to Birmingham were, I suppose, a little unusual, as indeed, in a way, my move to Newcastle, because as I think I've already mentioned, Con wasn't involved at all in my appointment there. My appointment in Birmingham was very much influenced, if not determined, by David Linton, who was the head of the geography department. He was a geomorphologist, a very well-known geomorphologist, but he was also interested in morphology more widely. And he invited me to come down to have a talk. And he was clearly sympathetic to the urban morphological approach. Another factor that was clearly important was that the existing lecturer in historical geography, Robin Donkin, who incidentally was one of Con's PhD students quite a number of years before, he was leaving to go to a post in Cambridge, and David Linton was keen to get a replacement. In fact, we agreed that I would travel down from Glasgow, where in fact I was at that time having study leave, travel down once a week and gave 2 lectures as a replacement for Robin Donkin. And then I took up a full-time appointment in April 1971. And that started a series of new developments, including my running of an urban morphology special option. But more particularly, while retaining my responsibility for the PhD students that I had in Glasgow who were finishing off, I also acquired new PhD students, and also inherited one from my tricker from Robin Donkin. And so quickly the momentum of urban morphology gathered, and so much so that by 1974, thereabouts, the group of urban morphologists that I had working with me began the urban morphology research group, which initially was weekly meetings of that group of almost entirely research students, and then quite soon Terry Slater joined us. He too, he'd come to Birmingham fairly soon after I had, and he too has been influenced, and continued for many years to be influenced by Con. Not so much directly in terms of direct communication as I was, but through his writings, and he became another key member of the urban morphology research group as it was developing in the late 1970s. And during that time, a number of my research students completed theses and moved on to academic posts. In fact, that was the norm in those days. The academic marketplace was very different then. And I think, almost without exception, probably the first 8 or 9 of my research students in the later 70s and beginning of the 80s, and through the 80s, went into academic posts, mainly in this country, in fact, because it was, at that time, very much a British group. The way it exists now and developed at the end of the 20th century and into this century, that was a very different phase of development.
In 1972, you have published Urban Brand Theory, Time Series and Morphogenesis, where you have proposed a framework gathering ideas derived from urban brand theory and the analysis of building cycles and morphological concepts. The development of this line of research would include some notable moments such as the publication of the book The Changing Face of Cities in 1987, addressing the cyclical perspective of the changing form of cities. In the first chapter of the book, you remind us whereas the role of economic fluctuations, innovations, and the economics of location are largely implicit in Cozen's work. Here they are made more explicit. Could you talk about this systematic attempt to integrate morphogenic and land economic conceptions of cities, and also about on how your interest in economy has emerged?
Well, it became very evident to me as I studied the very substantial fluctuations that there have been in the outward growth of cities, that there were some important, we might say call them mechanisms, if you like, that were operating, perhaps more accurately processes that were operating, that really had not yet been sufficiently explored. And looking at cities in the long term, particularly in my case over the last few centuries, it was evident to me that there were really three almost separate interests in fringe belts, albeit at that time that they weren't recognized as formally fringe belt interests. There was an interest in what you might call building cycles, time series for various aspects of building. There was the interest in the geographical mapping of changes in the form of cities, particularly stages in their growth. And there was also the very important aspect of the value of land and the approach that land economists were taking to the outward development of cities. This time series analysis was mainly by urban historians. So you had there the urban historians, you had the land economists, and you had the geographers. And they were, on the whole, not entirely, but on the whole, working separately. And it became very clear to me that these needed to be brought together if we were going to get a good understanding of the process of fringe belt formation. And not only formation, the other things that happen to fringe belts after they've been formed, because as you know, one of the striking things about fringe belts is that they have a very long life, long after they're at the urban fringe, and they become incorporated in the built-up area. And I had the opportunity at that time to study those three elements of the time series, the ring theory and the mapping, morphological mapping, to bring that together in a good set of data that I managed to bring together for the northwestern part of Glasgow. And this led to not just the papers you've referred to, but also the book that you referred to, which is very much interrelating those three themes. And this was a different, it was another perspective on the concept of fringe belts. It was, in some of Con's work, yes, he was really talking about time series, but he wasn't sort of drawing it out as a separate theme, and he wasn't in any way discussing rent theory. In fact, I remember when I first suggested to him that we needed to do this, that he was a bit cautious about my going into rent theory and sort of joining up with a land economist. But I think in later life, he probably did come round to thinking that that was a worthwhile thing to try and do. So I think you have there the background to the question that you're asking me there, about, particularly in relation to the 1972 book, paper, and also the book, which is later, comes in the 80s when a lot of other things have happened.
In the beginning of the 80s, you have edited The Urban Landscape, gathering 4 papers by M.R.G. Conzen, and including your introductory and concluding essays. Would it be fair to say that, despite the existence of other papers, this was the first attempt to define a Conzenian approach?
I think it probably was. I wouldn't be absolutely certain about that. I suppose quite a lot of people in the run-up years to that book were broadly thinking in Conzenian terms, although they didn't use the word Conzenian. In fact, Conzen himself was very self-effacing about that. And when that book that you've referred to was being prepared, I actually went up to Newcastle and spent a couple of days with him, stayed in the house with Colin and Frida, and we went through in some detail not just the 4 papers of his that were central to that book, but also the context. So I think at that time I got better insights than I had previously into the background in the German-speaking world to his perspective on cities. So, and then after that, those extensive talks with him and his comments on what I was proposing in the introductory chapter and the concluding chapter, that maybe you could say that was a sort of beginning of the Conzenian approach. And I do actually, all these years later, I still refer to that book when people come to work here in Birmingham, and they come here because of what they come to know of as the Conzenian approach. And that I still feel is a useful, all these years later, still 35 years later, is still perhaps a useful place to start if it's Con's approach, if we can call it that they're particularly interested in.
And how do you see the development of this approach throughout these 3.5 decades?
Well, of course, during that period, since 1980, there has been a tremendous change in the way in which urban morphology is pursued and the way it's organized as an international field. It's become much more of an international field. In the early days, it was very much in the German-speaking countries, and then picked up a little in North America, and picked up in the immediate pre-Second War years, and just after the war by Arthur Smales. But the big change came, I would say, at the end of the 1980s, and there are a number of aspects of that which I could talk about at length. The urban morphology research group then changed, from the mid-80s onwards. You need to bear in mind that here in Birmingham, up until then, it was very much a group of people who'd been influenced by writing PhD theses in Birmingham, and getting their degrees in Birmingham. They got their first degrees, many of them, in Birmingham, and then came through to do PhDs. From the mid-80s, this changed. The first person, as far as I remember, from what outside the country was Karl Popff, who later became very well known in the field. And as we went through the 90s, people, we quite soon, I suppose by the mid-90s, we reached the point where there were more people from outside the country were members than homegrown, if you like. And in later years, of course, some countries in the world have come to be very well represented here, notably from East Asian countries. So there's that major change in Birmingham, but more important than that is the change over those 3.5 decades in the World Organization of Urban Morphology. I think it probably begins in 1982 when we had a conference in Birmingham, which was very international in complexion and drew in play people from certainly many of the Western countries. That was followed by a conference in 1990, again in Birmingham, and that was even more international in complexion and included among those who came Anne Vernie-Moudon from North America, although she was in fact Swiss in origin, a range of other people who in different parts of the world were interested in urban morphology. And incidentally, as a prior to that, thinking back to that 1982 conference, Ivor Samuels at that time gave a paper in which, for many of us at the conference, was an introduction to the Muratorian and contingent perspectives on urban morphology. And those perspectives came through significantly, although not very significantly, in the 1990 conference. And at that conference, a number of us talked about the fact that really the time had come when we wanted an international organization of urban morphologists. And Anne Vernie-Moudon was very keen on the idea of having a get-together of people who were interested, and that led in 1994 to a meeting in Lausanne, where there was a British contingent, there was a Swiss contingent, and there were a few French. There was a French contingent. So several parts of the world were represented, although outside the English-speaking world, within sort of Europe, North America, and Australasia, still not that many. And then that meeting in Lausanne led to the formation of the International Seminar on Urban Form, to the foundation of an international journal on urban morphology, to the beginnings of an annual series of conferences to begin with. ISUF, as we called it, short for the International Seminar on Urban Form, was really becoming quite well known within a certain group. Proceedings of the conferences starting to be published, and we started then to be getting interest from parts of the world where there had not been that interest before, from South America, from Eastern Asia. And in fact, I'm just trying to think back to when we had the first conference that was outside Europe. I may be wrong, but I think it may have been in China. I could be wrong, or was it in Brazil? Anyway, certainly once we get into the 2000s, I think I seem to remember the one in China was about 2008. I'm not more exact about that. The whole complexion of the subject was now changing, because people were recognizing that there were a lot of other approaches to urban morphology. You yourself, in your own work very recently, have drawn attention to this and emphasized it. There was very much a spatial analysis approach, Michael Batty's work in particular. There was a space syntax approach, particularly the work of Bill Hillier, a Moratorian approach, which stems from the work of architects, particularly in Italy, which up to that time had not been all that well known outside Italy, although Caniggia had travelled a bit, and his work following in the Moratorian tradition was becoming known. And then, of course, there was the Konzinian tradition, as we were now beginning to call it. And so there was a tremendous change in terms of who was being involved and where, and the parts of the world they were studying and the parts of the world they came from. But it would be wrong to suggest that by the 2010 or so, we had yet reached the point where there was anything remotely like the integration of the various approaches. There were still separate schools of thought, if you like, that were on the whole going their separate ways. There are notable exceptions. Papers have been published in the journal Urban Morphology that cover a number of approaches and begin to see connections. But there's still a long way. There's still a long way to go. But that may give you sort of a rough outline of the what you call the 3.5. I think you said 3.5 decades of development, getting us up really almost to 2016.
In 1983 and 1984, you have published in the Transactions of the Institute of British Geographers your first papers co-authored with Susan Whitehand. These two papers represented a new and explicit focus on another fundamental theme in your morphological research, the agents of change. This line of research would include the publication of a new book, The Making of the Urban Landscape, in the beginning of the 90s. Could you talk a little bit about this?
Yes, I was certainly aware when I was doing the work that you referred to earlier on bid rent and its relationship to thinking about fringe bounds. I was aware of the fact that although we've done a lot of work on processes and we've given emphasis to the context in which those processes took place, that we hadn't perhaps stood back enough at that point to look at not just the individuals, but also the organizations that were responsible for those processes. And I applied for a grant. I can't remember the precise details. It must have been in the early 1980s, to explicitly connect agents and agencies of change with the processes that were going on in the landscape. And that led to the papers that you are referring to, and they were very detailed analyses of who was doing what in the landscape. Initially, we focused, if you put aside the earlier work I'd done in Glasgow on ownership units and the roles of owners, they focused very much on the architects, on the developers, and other agents that were involved, perhaps not quite so strongly as those. And we analysed for two very different cities in the UK in great detail how these various organisations and individuals had been involved. We relied very heavily on building applications, and these building applications went, for the places we were looking at, went back deep into the 19th century. this was a development in Britain, a sort of predecessor of planning applications. But they were very much concerned with individual buildings. But they contained a lot of information about who was trying to build and how they were trying to do that building. And we went right back to the end of the 19th. We could have gone farther back, but I think my recollection is we went back to the end of the 19th century and came through to what was the present at that time. And for two town centres, one suburban town, Watford, and one for a traditional market town, Northampton and county town, we worked through the building applications for every site in those town centres, and we constructed time series of different sorts of development, and in particular we focused on where the agents of change were coming from. Were they coming from inside those towns? Were they coming from farther afield? And we found change over time, as you would expect in that respect. We found differences, again, as you would expect, but there were some interesting contributions between a suburban place close to London and a freestanding place like Northampton, which was much better endowed with local architects. So they were much more deeply entrenched in the locality, and some of them were architectural firms that had gone through more than one generation of a family, for example. So that was very exciting. A lot of delving into records, which took my wife Susan Whitehand down into the nether regions of the council house in Northampton, where the old records were stored, down in the dungeons. And unfortunately, on one occasion, she found herself she stayed on late in the afternoon gathering data, and lo and behold, when she went to the door to try and get out, she'd been locked in and had to make an escape through a high window. And, fortunately, she didn't spend the night. If she had, of course, I'm sure she would have continued extracting data from the records.
2 years ago, Peter Larkin and Michael P. Conzen have edited Shapers of Urban Form, a book that is dedicated to you and to the line of research to which you have given such a sound contribution. In the beginning of the book, we can read, for JWR Whitehand, imaginative contributor to, patient teacher in, and tireless advocate for the international study of urban morphology and its relevance in shaping urban futures over more than half a century. How do you react to this initiative?
Well, it was, first thing to say is it was kept a total secret from me, so that I went to a conference, I'm trying to remember, was it in Porto?
Yes.
And right at the beginning of the conference, someone got up onto the platform. I think it might have been Michael Conzen, or Peter and Michael, I think. And this, I was sitting in the front there, listening, and suddenly discovered there was this book, and they were talking about me, and I was getting highly embarrassed, and then felt I had to go up onto the stage and say something, and I could say very little. But when I then came to see the book, I realized that this was a significant bringing together of work. I mean, the dedication to me was far too generous. But the book itself was important, and it included a remarkable number of people that they'd drawn together. Almost all, as far as I remember, had been associated with me in one way or another over 30 or 40 years. Many of them former research students. Many had by that time become distinguished researchers. Carl Kropp, for example, whose name I mentioned previously. He was in there, Peter Larkin, Catherine Arntz, who had then later gone to Germany, people who'd gone to posts of various kinds all over the world and come together in this volume, which in my honour, and I'm greatly flattered, rather embarrassed at the time by it.
In the beginning of the 90s, you have published Recent Advances in Urban Morphology. This was the first paper on urban morphology that I've read when I was starting my master thesis. There you have wrote, "The physical form of urban areas, the urban landscape or townscape, is suddenly attracting a great deal of interest among scholars in several different disciplines." Was this really a moment of change for our field of knowledge?
I think, yes, I think it was at a time of considerable knowledge, and I've made in our field, and I've made reference to the conference that took place at about that time. I think it was 1990. Did you say 92?
92. Yes.
That was published in Urban Studies. It was at a critical period. For me, perhaps the most important was just after that was published. You said it was 92.
Mm-hmm.
So it was 2 years before a number of us got together in Lausanne to see if it was going to be feasible to have a series of meetings in which the different perspectives were discussed. So yes, I think there was a change there. There were also some other. I mean, it wasn't a simple. It wasn't in any. I wouldn't argue that in any sense it was a. Yes, it was. It was. What's the phrase you used? It was not the. Well, you could say it was the birth of another phase, but there were also, and I think this is important, that within the English-speaking world there were also some what you might call counter-tendencies at that time. And I can remember I had probably about 5 research students working with me at that time, in the early 1990s, and there was obviously an influence coming from what you might call cultural studies, I suppose, and that was a very different influence from the quantification period that had come before it, and indeed different from the somewhat Marxist in orientation period in geography associated with David Harvey, which had come after the quantitative one, particularly from the 1970s onwards. So within my lifetime, I suppose, in a sense, thinking of this broadly within geography, that period of the early 90s was also, for some, a beginning to move away from thinking of the urban landscape and indeed cities more generally as objects, and being much more concerned with the cultural environments in which those objects were being created. And I mean, in a sense, we touched on this, and what you were asking me about the agents and agencies of change. I mean, in a way, that was taking us somewhat closer to that view, but not to some of the extremes that view proceeded to go through in the 1990s, and still evident to today.
The first number of the journal Urban Morphology was published in 1997. How did the project has emerged within ISUF?
My recollection is that by the time we got to the 1996 meeting of ISUF, it had become evident that we needed an international journal. Yes, fine to publish proceedings, but we needed to go beyond that. And given the stage that urban morphology was in, that it needed to be more than just articles, that we needed to have discussion. It was an important stage in development, and people needed the opportunity to express their views and their evidence in relation to that development of morphology. So we agreed, and it was characteristic right from the beginning, back in that 1997 issue that you're referring to, that it should have a number of components. It needed to have articles, of course, main articles. It needed to have viewpoints. It needed to have news, because at that time there was very little in the way of news about what's happening in that particular branch of urban studies that was available to people. So news, reports of other related conferences, book reviews, books that were focused on urban morphology, but also books on surrounding fields of knowledge. And also we decided to have a book notes section to get people up to date on what was coming out within the past 6 months or past year in the field. So that was then launched. I have a feeling that some of the first articles might well have started as presentations at one of the conferences, and the journal then took off from there. But we've always kept it down to a quality journal. We could so easily have allowed it to take off on a very wide spectrum. But we've kept it focused on what you might call the urban landscape. And the other thing that we've done that I think is important is that we've focused on quality, and the rejection rate is high. I'm not suggesting that we're rejecting good papers. I suppose one of the things really I'm drawing attention to is the fact that urban morphology is far from being the only field where, sadly, there is quite a lot of work being submitted to publication that just is not worthy of publication. This comes through in a rigorous refereeing process, but I'm not suggesting that refereeing processes are anything like perfect. So much depends on the individual backgrounds of referees. But we've been publishing about roughly 20% of the articles that are submitted. The fact that we are not submitting more is not to be seen as just a simple policy decision on the part of the journal editors and editorial committee. I think it reflects some changes that have particularly been noticeable within the last, I would say, 10 years. And that is tremendous pressures on people to publish. And stuff is being submitted prematurely. The basic work has not been done. And this is not by any means confined to the English-speaking world. About 2/3 of our papers come from outside the English-speaking world, so that the authors are not native English speakers. And it's quite evident that although the Americans started the interest, to put it politely, in metrics, measures of various kinds, and then of course the British picked up on this, but it's now spreading widely. And the sad thing is it's happening in a rather crude way. So people are, and indeed institutions that people are affiliated to, are putting pressures on their researchers to up the productivity as it's seen in very, very crude terms. And we're very aware of this in urban morphology, and that's part of the reason for the high rejection rate. Let's hope that, we give authors a lot of feedback. We have some very, very good referees. We're extraordinarily lucky with urban morphology, with the journal, in the referees. We have very few say that they're unable to referee. I would think it's less than 2%. But, let's say, or very occasionally simply don't respond. And some of the referees go to the most enormous lengths. They would take the paper and they would go through it sentence by sentence. Quite remarkable, the time that people would devote to it. It's unpaid work. And we benefit enormously from that. And the authors benefit enormously, even though their papers don't necessarily get published. They get a lot of useful feedback in the form of 2, 3, 4, even sometimes 5 referees' reports. So I think, as far as the Journal of Morphology is concerned, it's very much, I feel it's very much at the hub of some aspects, at least, of urban morphology. There are other aspects which are not as well represented as would, I think, be desirable. This is part of the problem which was evident when ISUF was founded, that you've got a number of strands of research that are not easily brought together. Some of them have individually got tremendous momentum. The work on spatial analysis is coming underway, so work on space syntax again. And the other schools of thought. But there is a need. There's no doubt about it. There is a need to stand back and look at these various approaches that are particularly concerned with the physical character of the urban environment, whether it be spatial analytical or whether it be a focus perhaps on fairly narrow aspects of the architectural structure of the city. There's a need to bring these together. And there are people who are conscious of this, and we've published some papers that have attempted to bring the various strands together. There's quite a long way to go with that. But these are exciting times, and let's hope over the next decade we will have more attempts to integrate some of the interesting strands that one can see coming through in the journal.
Going back to the quality issue, every author that has published in urban morphology, including myself, has the notion that you, as the editor of the journal, place a unique amount of work in editing to assure excellency in each and every paper that is published in urban morphology. Is that a fair appraisal of your work?
It does take a lot of time. I hope it's worthwhile. Some have told me that they feel it is. No doubt there are a lot of disappointed authors and who feel that really we're being unnecessarily selective. I don't feel myself that is the case. I don't feel that we are rejecting papers that could be resuscitated. If there is a paper that the referees feel has merit, then we go back to authors and we make suggestions as to how the paper can be improved. And some do that, some don't. Some give up at that point. But in emphasizing that quality aspect, I have to come back again to a point I made just now, that some of the work has just not been done conscientiously, and quite evidently, people are firing off papers just hoping that, might be lucky this time. And it's so obvious because they haven't even followed the basic rubric of how to submit it. Okay. And that's sad. And it's sad also, if I could add to that, that it's not just the youngsters. It's not just those coming into academic life and practice who are operating in that way. Where there are big projects that have been funded, perhaps to a well-known researcher, and then the paper comes in, with 4 or 5 authors, and sometimes big names as one of the authors. And clearly they have not done their homework, even to the extent of checking some basic aspects. I think that's a great shame. That people are so rushed, there's so much going on, that the papers are being submitted by junior colleagues, and they just haven't been given the vetting that they should have been done by the senior colleagues responsible for the project.
How would you describe the contribution of Peter Larkham, Karl Klopf, Susan Whitehand?
Oh gosh.
Michael Hopkins.
You are asking me a very difficult question there, and you've mentioned some very notable names, and I could speak for considerable length of time on all of them. Most of them I've probably mentioned at least in passing so far. One I haven't, I think, if I remember rightly, is Peter Larkham. And Peter's contribution has been quite remarkable. Not only as an academic, and the sheer amount of stuff that he's brought out in urban morphology, particularly in relation to conservation and planning, is exceptional. You mentioned I've already mentioned Susan Whitehand and her involvement, which of course goes way beyond those particular papers that I mentioned in relation to her, because she's been so important in maintaining the momentum of running the journal. You also mentioned Michael Hopkins. I've also already talked about Karl, referred to Karl and his major. He's made a major contribution in terms of our understanding of the structure of the discipline of morphology. Michael Hopkins is unusual among the research students I had. I'm trying to remember when Michael finished now, I think in the late 1990s probably. He's unusual at that time in bringing together what are now turning out to be important but under-investigated themes. That is, the bringing together the urban morphological and the urban ecological. Particularly I'm thinking of the interest that's developed over the last 20 years, in particular in ecosystem services. He didn't actually use that term, but he wrote a very interesting thesis and then subsequently papers on that relationship. And I'm very glad that the groundwork that he did there is now beginning to show fruit in some of the work of young people who are now starting on PhD theses. So the question what you've posed there is I've been very brief, but it's something that could take over several interviews.
A decade ago, you started research on Chinese urban form. Can you talk about this experience?
Well, yes. This really goes back to about 2000, 2001. At that time, we had a number of people coming from Eastern Asia, well, in the late 1990s, from South Korea and Japan, a few people. And then in 2001, there was an ISOF conference in Cincinnati, and followed by a very interesting field excursion in Chicago. And in Chicago, Michael Conn's son gave a splendid party for us, and at that party, a young Chinese research student, Kai Gu, came up to me and said that he was very interested in becoming a member of the UMRG, the Urban Morphology Research Group in Birmingham. And I was very impressed by him then and since. So I managed to get some money for him to come. And that really was the beginning of the Chinese interest, as distinct from the South Korean and Japanese. And we had a number of grants. One needed funding for something like that because a lot of travel involved, not just between countries, but within China itself. And very quickly, we started getting people from China saying they'd like to come and spend the time in the UMRG in Birmingham. I've lost count of how many there were, and quite a lot of papers, I'm glad to say, have come out of that. And the Chinese contribution has been remarkable, really, and the enthusiasm has been remarkable. And I'm glad to say many of the young people who've come here, mostly, well, I would say, just off the top of my head, probably about half of them, and I can't remember how many we're talking about in total in the period since 2001, but probably about half are PhD students, and the other half are fairly established scholars. And they have all been enormously enthusiastic, and they've picked up very quickly on key topics, key themes, key concepts in the field, and then they've been interested, in many cases anyway, not all, in the cross-cultural aspects that are involved. And it's hard to imagine two cultures that are so different as the European culture in broad terms and the Chinese. Well, the Chinese one, of course, being related to the Korean and Japanese and to others. But their histories have been very different, going a long, long way back. And indeed remained rather different even until quite recently. I can remember clearly when I was editing the journal called Area, this would be back in 78, when the possibilities of people travelling between those two countries began, really. We had a dead period from 49 through to 78 when there was almost no movement. And now, in fact, in the case of urban morphology, we've had more Chinese colleagues and research students in the last 10 to 15 years than from any other part of the world. So that has really gathered momentum. And there's clearly feedback going on as colleagues go back to China. So they have research students, and those research students become interested and write to me about the possibilities of coming to Birmingham. So it's been a very, very exciting time, and it is right now. And in the lunch we had before we started talking this afternoon, you would have met a few of them, you know. And we've got, I think, currently working here, we have 5. 2 research students and three, I think, fairly senior colleagues who are working here for different periods of time. Some here for 3 years, some for just 1 year. We've even had some who've come for just 6 months, very successfully, I'm glad to say. So it's very exciting. It continues to be very exciting.
The structure of urban landscapes is one of the most cited papers published in the journal Urban Morphology, together with Anne Moudon's paper Urban Morphology as an Emerging Interdisciplinary Field. In this paper, you focus specifically on the concept of morphological region. Could you elaborate how you see the development of this concept that was proposed by M.R.G. Conzen?
That is a fascinating question, and I'm very doubtful that I can give you an answer that you will find is satisfactory. There's unfinished business there, and I know that Con himself would acknowledge that, but he did tremendous groundwork in bringing together the different elements in the form of cities, and showing how we could in fact recognize unitary areas by various criteria within the structure of cities. But many of the studies that have been done of this have not really gone beyond what Con had proposed. Back in, let's see, what are we talking about, 1970s, 80s? And this needs doing. And I'm very excited that, in fact, today we have been talking about the possibility of someone you know well doing some work on this front, and is going to be working here, I'm glad to say, in Birmingham for a while. So, yes, we've gone so far with that concept, but one, more work needs doing on it to clinch it. And two, we need to be better in disseminating things that are not straightforward. They're not easy for people to grasp it. And geographers too, some geographers anyway, find these things difficult to grasp, although of course geographers are brought up on regional studies and the idea of the region. But of course Conzen went so much beyond that, and was showing signs of doing that even with the annex study back in 1960 and indeed before that. So it's unfinished business, and it really needs serious consideration. The paper you've referred to of mine is not it's not a particularly distinguished paper. It's surveying the scene, right? It's talking about what's being done and suggesting what the possibilities are. It's in a different category from Anne Moudon's paper that you mentioned, which is much more general, and quite rightly is well cited. The paper on the structure of the landscapes, you say, has been cited a bit. I wasn't conscious that it was. I can't believe that it's been cited all that much, because I think it probably suffers, as a number of urban morphology papers suffer, from being slightly too technical. I mean, fine for certain urban morphologists, all right, who are interested in the background to that, but probably not fine for people who are thinking of applying that concept of morphological units in fields like planning, where there's so much need for a more enlightened view of how we develop urban landscapes in relation to how they have developed in the past, and using that experience, good or bad, of how they developed in the past. So, okay, well that paper, when was it? 2009?
2009.
Yes. Okay, in 2009, but we're now in 2016. An awful lot more needs doing.
One of the issues in urban morphology that you have contributed to place just right in the center of the debate is that of comparative studies. What do you think are the main obstacles that still have to be overcome to achieve an acceptable level of comparison in morphological studies?
Well, of course, there are different kinds of comparison. One both we've just touched on, haven't done more than that. There's the comparison, which I think is very important, of cultures, different culture areas. And there are comparisons of the kind that are involved in bringing together the different approaches. And integration is the key, is the key here. It's understandable, really, as disciplines develop, that they will go into various branches as complexity develops within those branches. But at the same time, we need to keep our feet on the ground. We need to be seeing how these various strands fit together. And in relation to cross-cultural aspects, I think it's very testing for urban morphological concepts to take them from one cultural context to another and see how they stand up, particularly in relation to method. Taking methods, for example, that have been shown to be very effective in Europe and applying them, for example, in China. And I'm glad to say some of that is going on. There remains this knotty problem of the fact that, understandably, partly because of the way disciplines are structured, that people tend to follow particular roads. So, if you're an architect, certainly if you're an Italian architect, you may follow Aldo Rossi, you may follow Muratori, but unless under pressure, the need for those approaches to be integrated with other approaches. Imagine the Muratorians getting together with the spatial analysis people. You've tried it. I mean, you're showing that something like that needs to be done, but we need to do so much more. And it means getting back to fundamentals. And I'm glad to say that in the work that's now being done on the typological process, stemming from the Muratorian and Canadian way of doing things, that is now showing some signs of being grasped by Kanzian morphologists who can now see that morphological periods and morphological regions can be seen in relation to the way in which types develop over time. And when that can be shown also in a cross-cultural context, that's really getting exciting. But we're still in the early stages.
30 years ago, you and Terry Slater have carried out an exceptional interview with M.R.G. Kanzian when he was approximately your age. In the end of the conversation, you have asked him about the main challenges that urban morphology would be facing in the next years. I would like to leave you with the same question.
Well, in fact, this is very much related to what we've just been talking about, because, and I can't just off the top of my head remember now how Kahn responded to that, although I can probably guess that his response might not be so different from the one that I'm going to give you now, and which in a sense is really a reiteration of what I've just been saying in relation to the need for geographical comparisons at all scales. I mean, I talked about the cross-cultural one, but we also need more comparisons within individual cultural areas. I mean, these are demanding things to do, particularly the cross-cultural ones. And with the cross-cultural ones, the problems of language are tremendous. And with all credit to our Chinese colleagues, and indeed Japanese colleagues, and South Korean colleagues, the way in which they have wrestled with the English language, which is so different from their own languages, is quite remarkable. But even so, to actually publish in one of those other languages, to publish in English, for example, and many of them are now increasingly feel under pressure to publish in English. Indeed, there are some universities in China which are now specifying that their research students not only publish 3 or even 4 papers, but that at least one of them is in English, and that is really demanding. But the other aspect I touched on just now of the interrelationships between these various methods, and we haven't been comprehensive in that in any way. This is important too, and partly because anyway of the route that people take into different branches of urban morphology. They don't automatically see the importance of the interconnections between those different aspects. Perhaps those who see that most are those that in some senses are least able now to do anything about it, because they're moving out of there. They're retired, they've maybe got a few more years research, and one thinks of Conson himself, how up until within 6 months of his death, he was making notes about a textbook on urban morphology, which would be very wide in its coverage, including Eastern Asia, which was a no-go area when you think about it for a large part of his career. Certainly China was a no-go area. So it's a difficult one. We need to have more courses in urban morphology, and we need to have more courses that are integrative. I do believe that at UCL, there are University College London, there are enormous possibilities for this, because they have a number of different strands of work that are going on there, although at the moment they tend to be going along separate routes. But I think the opportunity is there, possibly then more than in almost any other centre I can think of. So I'm sure I've given you an inadequate answer to your question, but that's, I think, where we are at the moment.
Thank you very much, Professor Whitehand.